When Russian forces rolled into Ukraine in 2022, the world watched in disbelief. But according to Germany's top intelligence agency, that invasion wasn't the endgame, it was just the opening move. Bruno Kohl, the head of Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, recently revealed that Ukraine may be nothing more than a step on the journey westward for Vladimir Putin. It's a chilling idea, but one that's backed by solid intelligence, not speculation. While headlines focus on the devastation in Kiev and Odessa, behind the scenes, spies and analysts are seeing a bigger pattern. The drone strikes, missile barrages, and creeping military buildup aren't signs of a cornered dictator, they're signals of a long-term strategy. And that strategy, if it unfolds the way some believe it might, could redraw the map of Europe. Putin isn't satisfied with reclaiming old Soviet territory. Insiders suggest he wants to test just how far he can push the West before anyone pushes back. And if Ukraine was the test site, then the next target could be one of NATO's own. But this isn't just fear-mongering. According to multiple sources, Russia's long-term objective is to gauge NATO's strength, response time, and more importantly its unity. And that's where things start to get dangerous. Because what happens when an alliance built on promises is suddenly asked to prove them? That's the part Putin may be betting on. And the next chapter in this story only gets more unsettling. It's no secret that NATO is built on one core promise: an attack on one is an attack on all. But Putin, according to recent intelligence, may be plotting to challenge that very foundation without ever declaring a full-scale war. Bruno Kohl believes that Russia's strategy won't involve tanks storming through Western Europe, but something far more calculated, probing, poking, and provoking, just enough to make NATO flinch. Not enough to trigger an all-out response, but just enough to see who blinks first. We've seen the blueprint before. Back in 2014, Russia seized Crimea using what became known as Little Green Men, soldiers in unmarked uniforms who operated in the shadows. No flags, no insignias, just deniable aggression. Now, whispers in the intelligence community suggest a similar tactic could be used in NATO territory, places like Estonia, Latvia, or even Poland. Imagine Russian operatives in civilian clothing showing up in government buildings. Infrastructure mysteriously sabotaged. Cyberattacks hitting military networks. All carefully orchestrated moves to test NATO's reaction without technically crossing the line. But here's the real kicker: some believe it's not just about territory, it's about testing Trump. As the US edges toward another election cycle, questions swirl about America's future commitment to NATO. If Putin can create just enough chaos to provoke Article 5 without full-blown war, he might finally get the answer he's been waiting for: will the US still show up? And if it doesn't, the consequences could be far greater than anyone's prepared for. But this isn't just theory. Signs of a broader plan are already being spotted across Europe. If Ukraine was the warm-up, then the Baltics might be the main event. Intelligence sources and military analysts have quietly raised red flags for years, but now, those warnings are getting louder. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, three small nations perched along Russia's border, are all members of NATO. But to Putin, they may represent something else entirely: easy targets with deep symbolic value. Former Soviet states, proudly independent, and geographically vulnerable. Reports suggest Russian forces have been conducting military exercises suspiciously close to these borders, sending not-so-subtle messages about how quickly they could mobilize if the order came. Meanwhile, new satellite imagery has shown a concerning buildup of Russian troops and equipment near the Finnish border, just 35 miles away. Analysts at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS, believe Russia could be preparing for a shift to war footing. Not to launch a traditional invasion, but to pressure NATO through controlled escalation. A flare-up in the Baltics, even without a single shot fired, could be enough to throw Europe into chaos. And remember, this wouldn't be the first time Putin's played the long game. Crimea didn't fall overnight, it unraveled through misdirection, manipulation, and miscommunication. The Baltics could face a similar fate, only this time the stakes are even higher. Because if Putin dares to touch NATO soil even covertly, the alliance must respond. And if it doesn't, the illusion of unity could shatter in an instant. But Putin's ambitions don't stop at Eastern Europe. He's already signaling what might come next. At first glance, Finland might not seem like a prime target. It's neutral, quiet, and has a long history of staying out of trouble. But to Putin, its location and new alliances have made it a threat and a potential warning sign for the rest of Europe. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Finland did something historic: it officially joined NATO, ending decades of military non-alignment. That decision sent shockwaves through Moscow. Suddenly, Russia's northwestern flank was exposed, and NATO had a new doorway directly on its border. Satellite images from just weeks ago revealed something chilling. Russian military infrastructure, heavy weaponry, and troops assembling just 35 miles from Finland's border. And this wasn't just a defensive move. Experts say it mirrors early patterns from the lead-up to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. The message? Clear. Finland is being watched closely. And any sign of NATO activity near that border could be used as justification for a Russian response. Bruno Cole warned that any future aggression may not come immediately. Instead, it could unfold within 2 years of a ceasefire in Ukraine. That would give Russia time to regroup, rearm, and plan a more strategic push westward, possibly using Finland as a pressure point. This looming threat has forced Finland into overdrive, increasing defense spending and reinforcing its eastern border. But it's also raised the same question facing the Baltics. If Russia tests Finland, will NATO stand firm or hesitate? Because one misstep? And the conflict could spiral from regional tension to global catastrophe. But Putin isn't just playing a game of military chess, he's also gambling on political chaos across the West. Behind the scenes of war games and satellite images, there's another wildcard that could change everything: Donald Trump. As the US gears up for its next election, Putin isn't just watching military movements, he's watching politics closely. Because in Putin's world, American leadership isn't just a factor. It's the factor. Trump has a complicated history with NATO. During his presidency, he frequently criticized the alliance, calling it obsolete, and demanding that member nations pay more or risk losing US protection. To Putin, that wasn't just rhetoric, it was opportunity. Now, with Trump back in the political spotlight, intelligence officials are worried that Russia might see a narrow window to test NATO's resolve, especially if the alliance appears divided or uncertain about its obligations under Article 5. That's why German spy chief Bruno Cole's warning wasn't just about Russia's tanks or troops, it was about how much faith Putin has in America's willingness to respond. And if that faith wavers, even slightly, it could open the door to provocations designed to force a response, or expose the lack of one. One scenario officials fear involves little green men, unmarked Russian forces, like those used in Crimea, quietly stirring unrest in places like Estonia or Poland. These operations might not trigger an outright war, but they would demand a coordinated response from the West. If the US hesitates, or Trump chooses silence, that silence could echo louder than any missile. And Putin knows it. But the real twist in this story isn't just military or political, it's psychological. Because Putin isn't just challenging armies, he's testing the minds of entire nations. Not every invasion starts with bombs. Some begin with silence, a blackout, a cyber glitch. And in Putin's playbook, disruption doesn't always come with a declaration of war. Intelligence agencies across Europe are increasingly warning about a different kind of threat: gray zone warfare. It's subtle, it's quiet, and it's already happening. From disinformation campaigns to cyber attacks targeting power grids and government systems, Russia has been laying digital mines across the West. These aren't just technical disruptions, they're psychological weapons. The goal? Confuse, divide, and exhaust. One major fear is that Putin will strike not with tanks, but with covert sabotage, cyber assaults, or planted uprisings in NATO border states. All just below the threshold of a military response. Enough to rattle the system, but not enough to officially trigger Article 5. We've seen early versions of this before: mysterious train derailments, hacked infrastructure, false flag operations in Eastern Europe. Each one raising suspicion, but stopping short of certainty. And that's exactly the point. Putin doesn't need to invade the West to weaken it. He just needs to make the West unsure of itself. Unsure of who's attacking. Unsure of how to respond. And if trust begins to erode within NATO, Putin wins without ever firing a shot. Even now, reports claim Russia is building military bases just 35 miles from Finland's border, positioning equipment and troops not for open warfare but for leverage. A reminder that he's always watching. always close. And with Europe already stretched thin by the war in Ukraine, any move, even a whisper of conflict on a new front, could tip the balance. But the scariest part? It could all happen without the world even realizing it's already begun. If there's one place the world should be watching closely, it's the Baltics. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania sit on NATO's eastern edge, small nations with a giant target on their backs. Former Soviet republics, fiercely independent today, but geographically and historically vulnerable to Moscow's ambitions. And Vladimir Putin knows it. According to multiple intelligence reports, including those echoed by Germany's top spy Bruno Kohl, these nations are likely test sites for Russia's next big provocation. Not an outright invasion, but something more shadowy: hybrid tactics, political interference, strategic cyber attacks, or the quiet arrival of little green men, those infamous unmarked Russian soldiers who were used in Crimea's annexation. The goal? Force NATO into a dilemma. If one Baltic state is attacked, even subtly, does the alliance respond militarily, or hesitate? It's the ultimate stress test for Article 5. A scenario where hesitation could unravel the very foundation of NATO's promise: mutual defense. Because if NATO falters once, even slightly, it tells Putin that the West can be divided and perhaps defeated not by strength, but by doubt. This isn't just theory. Satellite imagery has already revealed Russian military buildups dangerously close to Finland and the Baltic borders. Defense experts warn that in the event of a ceasefire in Ukraine, an assault or a manufactured crisis in the Baltics could follow within 2 years. And Putin wouldn't need a full-scale war to succeed. All he'd need is a few weeks of confusion. A small occupation. A cyber blackout. A compromised election. Something that raises just enough chaos to fracture unity. These nations are preparing, but the truth is, they can't do it alone. Their defense depends entirely on the response speed and resolve of larger NATO powers. Which brings us to the ultimate question: if Russia pushes, will NATO push back hard enough and fast enough? That answer may determine not just the fate of the Baltics, but the future of peace in Europe. It's not just tanks or missiles that could shake NATO to its core, it's politics. Especially American politics. Because behind the warnings, the war games, and the satellite images, there's another threat looming, and this one wears a red tie. Donald Trump's potential return to power in 2025 is sending shockwaves through NATO leadership. While President Trump repeatedly questioned the value of the alliance, even suggesting the US might not defend members who didn't meet defense spending targets. For an organization built on mutual defense, that's like pulling the foundation out from under a skyscraper. And now, with Trump once again the Republican frontrunner, NATO's future feels more uncertain than ever. Many European leaders are already bracing for the possibility that if Trump wins again, US support for NATO could shrink or disappear altogether. That fear isn't unfounded. During his last term, Trump reportedly discussed withdrawing the US from NATO outright, only backing down after internal resistance. If Article 5, the heart of NATO's collective defense, is only as strong as the US president's personal opinion, then Putin doesn't need to win a war. He just needs to outweight a fractured West. And the signs of stress are already showing. Defense budgets are rising, emergency drills are becoming routine, and private conversations among EU leaders now focus on one uncomfortable scenario: what if America steps back, and Europe stands alone? Because if NATO falters, especially in the Baltics, it won't be just a regional failure. It will send a global message: alliances can be broken, power can shift, and democracy doesn't always win. That's why this isn't just about Ukraine, or Estonia, or even Finland. It's about whether the world's most powerful alliance will stay strong or quietly start to unravel under the pressure of politics, propaganda, and fear. And Vladimir Putin is watching closely. As the war in Ukraine rages on, it's easy to think the crisis is contained, a distant conflict playing out on foreign soil. But that assumption could be NATO's biggest mistake. Because if the intelligence is right, Ukraine is just the beginning. The warnings from Europe's top spies, the growing aggression on NATO's doorstep, and the quiet political fractures in the West all point to one terrifying reality: the post-World War II order is cracking. And the man holding the hammer is watching, waiting, and planning his next move. Whether through little green men, cyber warfare, or political manipulation, Putin doesn't need to roll tanks into Berlin to make his point. He just needs to make NATO blink. And if the West hesitates for even a moment, the consequences could reshape global power for a generation. So now, we're left with a chilling question: not if Putin will test NATO, but when. And when that moment comes, will the world's most powerful alliance rise to the challenge? Or will history remember this era as the one where deterrence failed, and a new era of unchecked aggression began? Because the truth is, the next chapter in this story isn't written by soldiers. It's written by what the world chooses to do now, before it's too late.